But soon anger and resentment grew amongst the wealthy and influential politicians that made up the assembly. Their issue was over the frequent abuse of power exercised by Elizabeth's successors. It ultimately led to the Civil War of 1642, resulting in the beheading of Charles I. With the monarchy removed, his son, also Charles, was forced to flee for his life. He famously sought refuge at Boscobel, hiding first in a tree, which is now known as the Royal Oak, and then spending the night in the attic of the house. Charles then travelled on in disguise via other safe houses before escaping to France. After an 11-year spell of England as a republic, Parliament decided to restore the monarchy, albeit in a much weaker form. The age of the monarch's absolute power was over, but with the restoration came a new era of architecture inspired by the great royal buildings of Europe, like St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Charles had returned as king to public acclaim, and in this era of optimism he was determined to match the grandeur of anything he'd seen in Europe whilst in exile. He commissioned the undisputed genius Sir Christopher Wren to rebuild the Gothic St. Paul's Cathedral after it was burnt down during the Great Fire of London in 1666. The taste for the new proved irresistible for the royals, and when Protestant William and Mary came to the throne from the Netherlands, following the removal of Charles's Catholic brother James from the throne, they employed Wren to extend Hampton Court in the new Dutch style. They produced no heir, nor did the next monarch, Mary's sister, Queen Anne, and as a result the crown passed to the next closest relative, who came from the House of Hanover in Germany. This led to 4 kings named George and over 100 years of what has become known as the Georgian period. And nothing typifies this era more than the city of Bath. This was the most fashionable place to be seen during much of the 18th century, and most members of the royal family spent time here, taking the waters for their health as well as enjoying the social life. The city is a Georgian creation and adopted the classical style of ancient Rome, which dominated this period. Great curving terraces were built into the hillside and even included the circus, which was an idealized version of the Colosseum in Rome. This classical style dominated the new Georgian houses being built, which form many of today's finest country houses. This was a period of great prosperity, where fortunes were made as the British Empire began to expand around the world. And with great wealth, the future George IV had no trouble spending it on extravagant buildings. This is the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. The fantasy Indian-style pleasure palace, with its onion domes and minarets, is a lasting testament to the self-indulgence of one of the most unpopular monarchs in British history. He built the pavilion as a retreat from London. Here in the coastal town of Brighton, he was well away from the scrutiny of parliamentarians who viewed his extravagance and decadent lifestyle as a mark of social injustice and a waste of public money, particularly at a time when Britain was at war with Napoleon in France. But in London, we see another side to the Prince Regent. He was passionate in his patronage of arts and architecture, and many of his achievements can still be seen today in many of the capital's landmarks, like Regent's Park, and the rebuilding and enhancement of the British Museum, the Tower of London, and Buckingham Palace, which his father had bought from the Duke of Buckingham in 1761. But a new era was ushered in on the 20th of June 1837, when a young 18-year-old girl was woken at 6 a.m. in Kensington Palace to be told that she had become queen. Her name was Victoria. She later married a cousin from Germany, with whom she'd fallen in love as a girl, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. As a passionate reformer, he was to influence many parts of London and was deeply committed to public causes. The world-famous Royal Albert Hall, which opened its doors in 1871, was part of his vision to promote culture and education. It's situated alongside a whole host of renowned institutions, colleges and museums that he commissioned. They're collectively and affectionately known as Albertopolis. And just to the north of the Albert Hall lies the highly ornate Albert Memorial. Erected a short while after the prince's sudden and unexpected death from typhoid in 1861, aged only 42. Grief-stricken Queen Victoria never recovered from the loss of her husband. She spent increasing periods at Balmoral in Scotland. Albert had designed and closely supervised the construction of this grand baronial-style castle to serve as their summer residence. And it was here that Victoria began to depend on a local servant, John Brown, who became one of her closest companions during her long period of mourning. After her husband's death, Queen Victoria reigned for a further 40 years, a period marked by a great expansion of the British Empire. She spent her last days here on the Isle of Wight at Osborne House, that had been once again designed by her long-departed husband. Victoria died in 1901 as the longest-serving female monarch in history. A reign of over 63 years. In 1932, it was here at the royal residence of Sandringham that Victoria's grandson, George V, started the Christmas Day tradition of broadcasting to the Empire. He had abandoned his father's German surname of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in favour of the more English-sounding name of Windsor. It was considered the best thing to do, given the anti-German sentiment at the time. And it's the House of Windsor that's reigned over the United Kingdom since 1917. Many royal events have marked this period, not least the abdication of the current Queen Elizabeth's uncle, Edward VIII, because he wished to marry an American divorcee. And the stammering address given by Elizabeth's father, George VI, made famous in the 2010 film The King's Speech, on the site of the old Wembley Stadium. In 1952, Elizabeth was the 38th monarch to be crowned at Westminster Abbey, almost 900 years after her distant ancestor, William the Conqueror. And most recently, in 2011, the royal wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton was watched by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And we end our story of royal Britain at the medieval palace whose name was adopted by the present royal family, Windsor Castle. As the Queen's preferred weekend home, it's the oldest and largest inhabited castle in the world, where today over 500 people live and work. It's here that the present monarchy is truly linked with its past, with a history going back almost 1,000 years. Originally built by William the Conqueror after his invasion of England, it's been a royal residence ever since, and the final resting place of 10 monarchs, including Henry VIII and his favourite queen, Jane Seymour. Elizabeth I entertained dignitaries here, and for a while it was even used by parliamentarians during the English Civil War as a prison to hold Charles I before his beheading. The extravagant George IV rebuilt the castle at vast expense, and it was the refuge for the royal family during the bombing campaigns of World War II. And after centuries of trials and tribulations, this great castle continues to thrive. A fitting place to end this story of royal Britain.